Georgians have a very unique view of the world, and it is one of the most neutral nations, I would say, in the world. And this predominantly has to do with the fact that they are, of course, a product of a Russian invasion, several Russian invasions, I would say. And this is something that is unique to Georgia, as for most of its history, it has been autonomous but not independent. And as many of the Georgians will tell you, they don't really trust many people. However, this is a benefit, especially if you are in the globalization and internationalization space, as if they do trust you, they tend to hold you close. And of course, I lived here for 2 years, so I know a lot of the people here in Georgia and how their mentality shapes exactly who they trust, what brings them trust, and how people in an increasingly multipolar world are building neutrality. Oftentimes, Georgia historically has been called the Switzerland of the Caucasus because it didn't get involved in wars in Armenia. It didn't get involved in wars with Russia. It just was there. And especially from the 1990s to the 2000s, all they wanted was to be the Switzerland of the Caucasus. However, there was one man who decided that that was not possible with the Russians right on their doorstep. That man would be known as Mikheil Saakashvili. And Saakashvili is somewhat of a polarizing figure here in Georgia. He is known by many different things. Realistically, the majority of Georgia does not like Mikheil Saakashvili. And this comes down to a lot of human rights abuses, the fact that he was moving towards populism, albeit he gave up the presidency and the prime ministership. So I would say that he was less dictatorial than what Georgians thought he was. However, whenever Saakashvili was president, he moved towards Washington, and not the European Union. He wanted NATO membership, but actually he was less pro-EU than people think. He was pro-West, but he wasn't necessarily pro-EU. Because one thing that is true of all of Georgia is the United States, America, is more popular and more broadly liked than the EU. And this is something that not a lot of people realize until they look at the data, which is overwhelmingly pro-US support. And that is something that is extremely interesting from a business perspective, as the way they run their businesses is closer in a lot of ways to the US. And growing up in the Midwest, where I'm from Missouri. Actually, Georgia is a fairly soft landing from that culture, because there's a lot of similarities between the United States in the Midwest and Georgia proper. Now, I would say that Tbilisi is sort of like the Chicago of Georgia. So, this city that I'm in right now is not, quote-unquote, the real Georgia. Instead, if you go to the villages, it is very similar to the Midwest. And this ties together perfectly with how the Georgians operate. They're very pro-America, and they're very close to American culture and how Americans deal with their life day to day. It's often that a lot of Georgians tell me, we were never that close to America. And then I talk with them more, and we sort of converse. And it's often that I do end up saying something that they're like, yeah, okay, you're very close to Georgia. And a lot of my Georgian friends will say, oh, you were born in the wrong place. You're very close to a Georgian. And I sort of laugh at those sorts of comments, because they want to me to identify with Georgia as opposed to Georgia to identify with America. And this has somewhat to do with Georgian pride, which, of course, I will get into how Georgian pride shapes the country and why nationalism is very unique in Georgia. However, what essentially you learn from living here is indeed that people live very closely to the rural Midwest, and you sort of get a feeling that the hospitality even is very similar to the Midwest. The language is different, the scripture is different. Obviously, looking at Georgian lettering, it's nowhere close to Latin. And also, additionally, you are looking at very unique differences in history because the United States Midwest is so new. But it's across these two cultures that you get a lot of overlap. Family is the cornerstone of both the Midwest and Georgia. Additionally, the way that people talk is very direct, both in Georgia and in the US. People are not afraid to say things that are inherently unpopular. There's a sort of level of charisma that is within both countries. People have a little bit of a funny accent compared to the region. If you hear a Georgian speaking Russian, for instance, it's very unique. But it's with that uniqueness that you can't really compare Georgia to any of the regional folks, right? You can't really compare them to the Russians. You can't really compare them to the Turks. You can't really compare them to the Azerbaijanis. You can sort of compare them, it's a stretch, but you can sort of compare them to the Armenians because they're both Christian. They both have a lot of overlapping history. They're both native to what is this land, and they intermingle. But I'd say that in a lot of ways as well, Armenia is very close to the south, the southern United States, at least within Armenia, because outside of Armenia, Armenians tend to be fairly liberal. You know, they adapt to where they are. And so it's with this that there's a very unique sense of being Georgian, just as there is of being Midwestern. And so it's with this that you get a very unique culture that is welcoming but hesitant. And of course, if you want to navigate this culture, if you want to learn more about how this culture works, feel free to book a call on Calendly, 15 minutes, absolutely free, one-on-one. If you like the video, feel free to like it. If you really like the video, feel free to share it. If you're looking to join me on the internationalization and globalization journey, feel free to subscribe. This has been the Traveling Report, signing off.